Dear students, today in this particular disaster management class of MBA of Bangladesh Open University, we would like to discuss about the environmental and social impact tools and techniques. That means SIA and EIA. So let's see what do we mean by EIA. EIA means, you see, environmental impact assessment. This is a particular tool that is being used for decision making regarding any particular project. It is not only decision making aspects regarding the particular project. When we are going to formulate a new particular project, so EIA is mandatory and precondition of this particular assessment situation. Through EIA, we would like to assess the nature of expected impact of a particular project to be implemented in near future. For example, we have taken so many mega projects in Bangladesh. For example, Jamuna Bridge project, Jamuna multipurpose bridge project. This particular project was apprehended that this particular project would definitely help us in terms of communication, mobilization, transportation and services for the common people of North Bengal, and they would also able to provide lot of their products in this particular central or central, that is capital city Dhaka. And again, they would also be benefited out of this particular products from coming from different part of the world to this particular central part and eastern zone. So when we are having this particular project, definitely we need to assess this particular consequences of this particular project. So that's why EIA is that much mandatory of this particular formulating of a particular project. Similarly, when we are talking about a particular disaster or post-disaster situation, so then what we need to do? For example, in year 2007, we had our devastating cyclonic storm that is called Sidor, and in year 2009, we had also another cyclonic storm that is called Aila. These two disasters had lot of havocs and lot of hazards within the people, at least 30 million people of coastal belt in Bangladesh. So when this particular disaster happened, then there was not only human casualties, it also devastated the infrastructure, housing situation, standing crops, health hazards, and also it was also created acute crisis of supply of pure drinking water. So when you are going to assess this particular situation, then we need to formulate a new particular project. But once we are going to formulate this particular new particular project, EIA is a mandatory part of that particular project. That means it's not like that we are taking a particular project and this particular project definitely would help us to mitigate this particular disaster and hazard situation. Rather, we are also looking at whether this particular project would be that much sustainable in nature and it may not have that much devastating negative impacts and implication on a particular human community of that particular society. And that's why we are exploring the need of this kind of EIA and SIA. Is it clear to you now? Any question about this particular situation?
No, carry on.
Okay. Then you could see the environmental assessment is carried out by the development, although the task is often carried out by the environmental consultants. Environmental assessment is also carried out in order to produce the environmental statement. The environmental statement, of course, it must include the description of a particular project, location, design, scale, size, description of significant effects, mitigation measures, and a non-technical summary. So these are also very much framework of EIA, or that is called environmental impact assessment. Well, EIA is not only applicable to formulating a new particular project, rather EIA also mandatory in assessing a particular situation. For example, if we don't take even a particular project, even the environmental impact assessment is also very much applicable to any particular community in terms of pollution, in terms of mismanagement, in terms of, for example, traffic mismanagement or any kind of particular human and man-made disasters. No exception actually. For example, the human-induced disaster, Rana Plaza disaster that happened very recently in Bangladesh. So you know the nature of devastation out of that particular Rana Plaza. When you are going to assess this particular situation, then you could see this particular building collapse also created lot of hazardous situation within this particular areas, no doubt about that. So we can also assess that particular situation. So before formulating any particular project, EIA can also be part of that particular situation, and for formulating a new particular development project, EIA can also help in this particular regard. So no exception actually. Now scoping for EIA. Scoping is usually identify the key issues concerned at the early stage in the planning process. And scoping should also be carried out at an early stage in order to aid site selection and identify the possible alternatives. The scoping process should involve all interested parties such as the proponent and planning or environmental agencies and members of the public. So we can also give another example here. For example, due to ILA, more than 1,800 kilometer embankments have been devastated in the coastal belt of Bangladesh. Out of 4,000 kilometer of embankment, more than 1,800 was devastated. Now, when you are going to assess this particular situation, you could see some particular polder was so vulnerable. So, if you rebuild that particular part of that particular embankment, that may not be sustainable anymore. So, in that case, what we need to do? We need some kind of alternative arrangement. For example, you just leave those particular polder area which is that much vulnerable, and you have to select a new particular area which might be that much sustainable in terms of soil erosion and in terms of other potential threats of cyclonic storm or tidal surge or any kind of situation within this particular coastal belt. So, this is another new dimension of EIA. So, within the scoping, you have the wider opportunity and scope to select, and you know it better than anybody else what should to do and what shouldn't. Another concern, why carry out scoping? So, the answer is very simple: to identify the key issues and concerns of the interested parties. Who is concerned and what are the concerns? Why are they concerned? And what is the threshold of concern where change becomes unacceptable? And also, when effective scoping occurs, delays are caused by additional time being required to assess the unidentified impacts. Again, you could see, once the site for development has been selected for scoping angle changes, there will be a decrease in the number of issues and an increase in attention to detail. Scoping is an ongoing exercise throughout the course of the project. That means, when we are going to identify a particular situation, then we need to concern about so many major issues to be part of or to be purview of this particular attention of EIA. And another important thing is that when we are going to assess this particular situation, side by side SIA, that is social impact assessment, is also that much important and mandatory. Now, let's see what is social impact assessment. So, before we going to that particular situation, you could see at a glance that how could we analyze the EIA legislation in developing countries. One important thing to note that EIA is very much mandatory globally. It is started in United States of America during 1980s, when there was a big pipeline that was drawn within the Alaska state of United States of America. At that particular stage of early development, so they had to think twice about the consequences, negative consequences of this particular construction of pipeline within this particular Alaska. And since then, EIA has been introduced globally, and World Bank, IDE, USAID and other development partners who are providing a lot of supports globally in terms of development activities in developing countries, they have made this particular EIA and SIA as part of the mandatory enforcement and implementation. We must remember this particular situation. And you will be also under to know that Government of Bangladesh has also ratified this particular environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment. They have also incorporated as part of the law in our country. So, from that particular perspective, EIA and SIA is that much mandatory. Now, you could see the scope of legal regulation. We are having the regulatory framework. It is part of the constitutional provision nowadays in Bangladesh as well, no exception. And we are also having some institutional considerations. For example, you need to identify and permit the authorized agencies and their respective powers and functions, and you need to spell out all their terms of reference and conditions to be part of this particular involvement of this particular process of environmental impact assessment. At the same time, you have to know about the procedural aspect, that is communication procedures, timetable, reporting requirement, and also the mitigation parties and public participation, review and decision-making appeals, transboundary impacts, monitoring assessment, and other situations too. Particular situation, ETP is mandatory. Effluent treatment plant, that is very much mandatory part of this, and that is also part of EIA. Well, we are having such like legal provision actually, but we hardly follow it, we hardly enforce it, and we hardly monitor this particular situation. Otherwise, we are having this kind of provision in our constitutional law and purview. No exception actually. Well, there are two things. When you are going to have a prior clearance from Ministry of Environment for setting up a particular industry or development project, then you must obtain this particular permission. And after successfully completion of this particular project, it is their role and responsibility to inspect whether you have acted as per the provision or was the part of this particular mandatory situation. So that is part of the monitoring mechanism actually, no exception. Now, next step is SIA. SIA means social impact assessment. So environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment goes side by side. Yeah, there is very in-depth and interrelationship between these two particular situations. So by social impacts we mean the consequences of a human population of any public or private actions that alter the ways in which the people live, work, play, and relate to one another, and also organize to meet their needs and generally cope as member of a particular society. So there are so many areas to be identified within this particular social impact assessment, in terms of people's livelihood, in terms of people's activities and performance, in terms of people's role and other situation, and in terms of people's relationship in terms of institutional, formal or informal situation. For example, a particular community, within this particular community you could see lot of interactions within this particular people. Again, within this particular community, if you differentiate between the Hindu and Muslim people, then you could see they are having the different two communities, different culture, different religion, different performances and different activities. Even perception of disaster and hazard is also very much different from the social purview and from the culture and religious purview. For example, when there is a hazard or disaster in the coastal belt, devastating cyclonic Aila or Sidor or devastating flood or some kind of Manga syndrome in northern part of Bangladesh, you could see people have their own perception about this particular hazard and disaster, especially the response mechanism. When you are talking to a particular Muslim community people, then they definitely say from the fatalist attitude, what we say, the quote unquote, বিপদ আল্লাহ দিয়েছে বিপদ থেকে আল্লাহ উদ্ধার করবে, দুর্যোগ আল্লাহ দিয়েছে দুর্যোগ থেকে আল্লাহ উদ্ধার করবে. Similarly, if you ask a particular Hindu community people, then definitely he or she will say বিপদ ভগবান দিয়েছে বিপদ থেকে ভগবান উদ্ধার করবে. Again, if you go to a particular Christian minority or Buddhist minority people, they are having the similar response, no exception actually. That means this is the dependency on supernatural power or the exceptional power, mighty power, and that is because of this religious perspective, and that is also because of this particular cultural construction, no exception actually. So this particular situation is also very much important, because when there is a alarm, red alarm in the coastal belt to evacuate this particular situation, because there might have a particular disaster within 6 hours. So many people, they don't leave their homes. The reason is multifarious. One of the reasons is that is dependent on this particular supernatural power. So this is also need to be considered, and for overcoming that particular situation, you need to have a motivational drive. This is not the case. Danger is at your doorstep, so you have to take the preparation. You have to respond this particular danger, and you have to come out from your own house in a safe and secure place. That is much more important actually. So in this way, we could see social impact assessment, it is not only the institutional purview, rather it is also very much part of the cultural, religious, social and other situation. And similarly the food value, and when you are going to a particular shelter home, for example, the women, they are that much reluctant to share a common place, because culturally and religiously they are having their strong norms and values not to share with the other people. So common place, sharing a particular common place, staying in an open space, it is practically absurd for a particular conservative women in rural Bangladesh actually. But we hardly consider about those particular aspects, but it is the time to consider about those particular aspects as well. And that's why nowadays we have shifted our paradigm. That is called the paradigm shift. When we are going to construct a particular new cyclone shelter, we are considering this particular cultural aspects and religious aspects too, and that's why we have named it, we must construct a gender friendly shelter home. Gender friendly. That means women must have the privacy within this particular cyclone shelter. They must have a feeding place, and many women, they are very much part of the pregnancy, and many of them are very much part of the adolescent stage. We need to consider about the prime security of those particular people as well. Now we would like to share the knowledge about a basic model for social impact assessment. You could see the link between the environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment on the social, environmental, reasonable and biophysical impacts in several ways. For example, the social and biophysical impacts can vary in desirability, ranging from the desirable of adverse. They also vary in the scale of questions of whether a particular family will create 50 or 100 jobs, for example. In contrast, it may help in assessing the how hundreds and thousands of people have negatively impacted out of Sidor or Ayla. Now, you could see when we are going to consider a particular rehabilitation project after Sidor or after Ayla, then we need to carefully assess whether this particular project would definitely help mostly the entire community people or a particular group of people. That is the major concern of modeling this particular EIA and SIA. If it be only 50 people out of 1,000 people, they would be beneficial out of this particular project, then this particular project may not be that much sustainable and viable, and it may not be that much helpful for the entire community people. Rather, we need to consider, we need to prioritize a particular project or a particular development activities which might have the wider scope to provide the support in terms of economic activities or in terms of employment generation or in terms of environmental sustainability or in terms of poverty alleviation or in terms of gender friendly roles and responsibility to be played by that particular project. So we need to consider about the most of the people's benefit out of this particular development project or development activities. Well, ideally, you are right. Ideally, we are talking about this particular situation that a particular project might be helpful for the community people. But as you mentioned that we are having a lot of institutional barriers. And it is institution, it does owned by a particular group of people who are part of the power structure. And that is the big problem actually. If you see, for example, who are going to monitor and execute this particular project. For example, it is LGD, Local Government Engineering Department. They are having this particular technical knowledge and they are being supported by the donors and development partners all through. Because most of the rehabilitation projects are being taken by this particular LGD or Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation. So when you are going to field in practice and in reality, you could see that lot of institutional barriers that happened out of this particular project implementation, because people are having their own attitude, people are having their own vested interest, and people are also having some kind of attitude to having some kind of benefit out of this particular project, and that creates a lot of barriers and as part of the development activities. So ideally speaking, a particular project is that much helpful for the community people, but when you are going to implement this particular project, you need to consider those particular institutional barriers, and also it is sometimes it is very much part of the political implications. For example, your target group of people, who would be the beneficiaries? If you are not biased in identifying most affected people, that is called the most vulnerable group of people, most destitute group of people, then it's okay. The project definitely would help those particular group of people. But when you are going to identify a particular group of people, within that particular people, a particular political elements are there, then it's a big problem. And it happens in our country. So we need to consider this particular situation. But again, you know, because of the some complex power structure, and because of the some kind of undue exercise of authorship, all development projects are not going to be implemented as per purview of the ideal situation. There might have some kind of deviation, and it is again the reality of any particular development project or development activity that you have to accept. But it's again, there might have some strong mechanism to overcome this particular problem. If you are having this kind of monitoring mechanism, for example, so a neutral group of people might be part of this kind of monitoring mechanism, then they could intervene and interfere about this particular irregularities, and in near future the government might be that much concerned to introduce a strong regulatory and monitoring group of people to be part of smooth implementation, and that particular project might be helpful for that particular community people as we desired and as we in framework. Now the question about the social impact assessment framework. It's like the SIA or social impact assessment. You could see the last paragraph of this particular write-up. A strength of the comparative social impact assessment model is that with the appropriate data source, those which can be collected frequently, such as CEDAW-affected people's rehabilitation or resettlement option, it allows for an interpretation of dynamic events and can provide monitoring of short-term impacts. We already discussed about this particular situation. As he asked about the institutional barriers, and we also explained in details of this particular, so no further explanation about this particular social impact assessment framework. We have talked a lot about this particular social impact assessment and environmental impact assessment. Now this is a particular framework how we can stage in project policy and development. So there are so many steps to be followed in particular social impact assessment. For example, the planning and policy development, construction and implementation, operation and maintenance, and abandonment or decommissioning, the project type and setting. The construction of an embankment to control the intrusion of salinity in southwest coastal belt of Bangladesh. For example, this is a particular project. We are introducing a particular project to control the intrusion of salinity or control the tidal surge in the southwest Bangladesh, because we got the bitter experience of CEDAW and ILA. When CEDAW happened in year 2007, then it was more than 20 feet tidal surge in this particular coastal area, and that devastated, not only devastated the coastal people, 3,000 people were dead and other people are missing, and also hundreds and thousands of trees and standing crops and homes and other infrastructures are devastated out of this particular CEDAW. At the same time, what was the most adverse impact of that particular CEDAW, that intrusion of saline water. When those particular high tidal surge occurred in this particular coastal area, then more than 20 feet water was get in, and once this particular situation was settled, after that most of the coastal area was very much part of the mergeable or submergible situation, stagnation of saline water, and it was not possible to drain out all this particular water from that particular area, and that created a lot of havoc within this particular. And you will be honored to know that till today in many part of Patuakhali, Borgona, Borishal, Bakirganj, Bhola and other part, the saline water is also very much visible. And again, after post-disaster that is Aila. If you go to this particular Bagherhat, Khulna and Satkira region, you could see the many people till today they are living on the embankment side. They are unable to go back because there is a 6 months stagnant salinity within this particular residential and most cultivable area of that particular part. And hundreds and thousands of people, they are suffering out of that particular situation. So we need to assess those particular situations too. Why this particular situation and how we can overcome this particular situation. That is the major, not only environmental disaster, it is also very much human catastrophe in terms of agricultural productivity, in terms of people's income earning opportunity, in terms of women's involvement in many activities, income generation activities, and in terms of infrastructural situation, for example, children's schooling and other support services by the local government agencies. So, lot of challenges that has been created out of that particular Sidor or Aila, and still we are struggling to resolve that particular mechanism. How to resolve this particular situation, we even do not know. There are a lot of uncertainties that have been created out of that particular Sidor and Aila situation. So, that is why we need to consider about this particular situation. For example, abandon or decommissioning, we already mentioned about this particular situation. When for example, there is a particular polder area, there was not a single sluice gate within this particular polder. Now it is a time to commission a particular sluice gate in this particular area, because you need to drain out the saline water too. So that is much more important area to be considered. Now you need to identify the social impact assessment variables. That is important. So social impact assessment variable, it does include the population characteristics. You could see, as you mentioned about the institutional, you could see that in number 2, community and institutional structure. We already mentioned about this particular situation. And the political and social resources, we already explained about this particular situation. And individual and family changes and community resources. So these are the major areas to be considered for identifying this particular social impact assessment. That means when you are going to assess this particular situation, you need to develop a particular either a structured questionnaire or a particular checklist for focus group discussion, and with those particular tools and instrument, you have to conduct this particular assessment so that you can able to assess the overall nature of vulnerability out of this particular disaster or hazard in a particular area. It might be Aila, it might be Sidor, it might be Katrina, it might be Rita, or it might be any other hazard and havoc globally actually. You could see when in year 2004 the tsunami occurred. So within this particular Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand and Sri Lanka, hundreds and thousands of people had to lose their lives, and many houses and infrastructure that was devastated out of that particular tsunami, and the islands people became much more vulnerable. For example, the Malabar people, Nicobar or Andaman Island people, they were the prime target of this particular tsunami. And after that particular tsunami, I visited Indonesia, and I also visited the Sri Lankan part of Galle, where 40,000 people are devastated, and there I found a particular common graveyard where 3,000 people are buried together, because there was no other way at that particular stage. So it is a human catastrophe, no doubt about that. Similarly, Japan, in the year 2011, you could see tsunami, then earthquake, then tsunami, then nuclear disaster. 3 havocs. It is a consecutive chain effect, unfortunately. So first of all, it was earthquake. The second was the tsunami, and the third one was the nuclear explosions. 3 nuclear plants are exploded, and you could see the frequency and the magnitude of spreading of that particular radiated situation. It was quite alarming, and within the Japan, a particular province that was declared abandoned, and importing any particular food item or agricultural products was not allowed from that particular part to any other parts exporting. of this particular situation, and it took more than years together to minimize that particular situation. Till today they are also struggling, and they are also in a very much worried situation whether this particular radiation will have the long-term effects and impacts and implications on human and animal bodies and other agricultural production and other situations too. We are almost at the end of this particular situation. You could see the steps in social impact process. It is the public's involvement. People, they are the prime. They know once you are going to formulate a particular new project, it is the people's priority. It is not yours option. It is the people's option that need to be considered. But at the same time, we need to introduce some kind of strong justification that must be part of the scientific reasoning. People might have a lot of demands, for example, because they need to fulfill their own unmet need, but you have to prioritize those particular unmet need first, and then you have to introduce the scientific reasoning to resolve that particular situation. No exception actually. And then identification of alternatives. For example, describe the proposed action or policy change and reasonable alternatives. Then you have to consider about the locations, you have to consider about the land requirements, you have to consider about the needs of ancillary facilities, that is road, transmission lines, soil lines, and water lines, supply of water line, and you also need a construction schedule. And then the side of the workforce, construction and operation by year or month or years together. And then facility size and shape, and need a local workforce and institutional resources. So these are the prime agendas to be considered in introducing this kind of social impact assessment within a particular vulnerable areas. For example, after post-disaster havoc or post-disaster and post-hazard situation. So these are the overall discussion about the social impact assessment and environmental impact assessment. If you have any further question or clarification or comments, feel free to pass. We are concluding this particular session here. So still if you are having any kind of observation or comments or question, feel free to